as physically possible. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm now going to pass across to the wonderful Bob and Jan to describe with ourselves some of the ins and outs with regards to the talent that we require within this sector. And I see some certain pictures from many thousands of years ago with regards to how we used to mine. Over to your wonderful selves, gentlemen.
Thanks, Sarah. It's great to be here. Can you just indicate you can hear me? And I don't know if you can hear Bob as well.
Yep, we can certainly hear yourself, Jan. And Bob, do you want to say something?
Yes, can you hear me, and can you see the presentation?
We
Yep,
can see
great. Thanks, Bob.
and we can hear and see you as well, Bob. Thank you. Okay,
Thank you for the opportunity. One thing we wanted to talk about today was about some activities that Jan and I have been involved with for some time now around developing an approach for professional development in mining, and to set some context and then walk through that a bit. So the slide that you're seeing now, talking a little bit about the standard risk profile that we often use in the mining industry, where we talk about where should we focus our attention around risk management. And you'll see that we typically want to focus in areas where we have really high risks. And skills vanishing is such an area. So you look, there's a huge value component to this. The fact is, without skills, we don't successfully operate these mines for any perspective, technical or any of the social, any of the environmental aspects. And the fact is that it's a near certainty this will happen, because we've been seeing it and talking about it for quite some time, potentially decades or even longer. So let me go. I put two bookends here, which is one from the 1940s, where people were talking about this particular issue and what could we do, and it's so difficult in the midst of a huge crisis. And come forward 70 odd years, another midst of another crisis, one that's been decades in the mining industry, and a much shorter one, but still a crisis that is impacting mining very severely. So we've talked about this problem for a long time. The challenge remains, and it keeps getting worse. So what's going on? So there's a number of aspects to this, I think, around the history. So one bit is perhaps that we've been talking about it for so long that we're in the position of crying wolf. So people go, oh, they've been talking about that for decades, for 100 years, and it's still okay, so why worry about it? And perhaps there's some of that. Another aspect that I think is really important to note is that the fact is that in mining, indeed in most industry, we get by. We find workarounds, we find ways to make things successfully happen, whatever it takes, for the better or worse. I'm sure we've all seen some of that. And another aspect that I'm showing now, and here's your graphics that are hundreds of years old and such. So once upon a time, we had a clear understanding that people would enter workforces, they'd be apprentices, they would gradually become journeymen, and they would master their trades. And this would be happening and supported by a community practice. And the fact is, in the mining industry, we've really lost that community of practice in the last few decades. And so we now have a case where we have a new graduate coming to industry, and it's rather unclear to them. Are they coming in as an apprentice? Or are they coming in as a journeyman, a practitioner who truly knows their art? And the fact is, many people outside the engineering world think that engineers learn all they need to know about engineering at university, and they come as fully formed engineers, and they're good to go. And for any of us who have ever managed that transition, we appreciate, in retrospect, how little we knew and how difficult it was to go from being ostensibly an engineer to really being an engineer as we made that transition. And the fact is, often when Jan and I and others have been talking to companies about this, especially non-engineers, they go, well, don't they come out of school knowing all those things? Why would we need to help them develop their skills in the workplace? So it's quite a different view of the world. And that's something we need to clarify. And it's a clarification required for, what is the role of the university? It's got a definite role, and that's unclear to people. There's a role for industry and communities of practice within industry. And that's been lost because the fact is, in the last decades, we've lost many experienced practitioners through these cycles up and down of the industry, the attractiveness of the industry. And so we have at many operations globally. The fact is there's no experienced community of practice to pass on the practice to new graduates. So they're in the position of being expected to be so brilliant that they can learn all these things in a few years. And it really doesn't happen. And then for individuals coming into industry, what are the expectations we have? Well, if there's no skilled or experienced master to pass on what that is, they get to invent it for themselves. And that often leads to some real tragic shocks and surprises for the operations, for the people, etc. The reality is they find ways to get by, but often with quite suboptimal getting by behaviors, I think. So on to the next, and that's so how really do engineers function at operations? How should they function? It's really quite unclear. What is the impact that they should be making? And often you'll hear these big debates at sites and within companies about the need to focus on purely technical activities, purely leadership activities, et cetera, with people plugging their own beliefs and such. But I've found it quite funny when you go to an operation and they go, oh, those are just technical people. They focus on technical issues. And I've never experienced very many people who work in an isolation where they don't work with other people of incredibly varying experience, different needs, different perspectives, et cetera. So no one works in isolation. At least I've never seen anyone who has. I suspect that on some island somewhere there is that person who's been lost, but they're quite a rarity. So what do we expect from process engineers at sites? We expect they're going to help with managing the process so it keeps running well every day. And when there are problems, they help solve those problems. So on the process management side, they interact with the operations staff, give guidance on perhaps good set points, et cetera. And when troubles exist, they get out there and really sort out what is the real problem, and then try to find root causes, develop solutions, implement solutions, and with luck, make it so that the problems don't repeat in another 3 or 4 months, so on and so forth. The reality is quite different at most operations, as I'm sure that we've seen. And so what you see when you're out there, you can look at an operation and through some analyses, you can see what value would it be generating with the best of all possible worlds, where process management was working well, problems were being solved, they weren't coming up often, et cetera. So that would be the best world. What value would be creating? On the other side, what's the worst world, where we don't manage well and we don't solve problems well? And you can see, typically at any one operation, by just contrasting 2 periods of time, the difference in value from those extreme differences in behavior. And at a large site, it can be worth tens of millions of dollars a year. In fact, perhaps even hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And yet, often we take no action. And we see that on average, we're getting average behavior and we're getting by. And people seem happy with that. And the reality is that often that getting by is the enemy of taking any action to change things. Because we get by, people go, oh, it isn't really that bad. And so in the short term, okay. But then you look over the course of years and what you see gradually decreasing performance of most operations. And you can see it in some of the graphics and some of the discussions at various conferences and such. And the other thing you see is because skills aren't valued, they're increasingly lost. And so if in a year you can't see much of a decrease in skills, if you look over 10 or 20 years and you look at the nature of the staffs and indeed the competency of the staffs, they've dramatically decreased. And I know that Julian earlier in the week talked about competency development and its value. And that's really what we're talking about here. Much the same is trying to set a stage for why we need to understand and develop competencies for our people. Oops, wrong way. So the thing that we've been working on quite a bit is trying to find, yes, Dan.
No, I was waiting for it to come up. Oh, there we go. Yeah, that's great.
Okay, sorry. So what we've been looking at is saying, well, if we don't have a community of practice, how do we provide a virtual community of practice? How do we expose people to the skills that they need for the workplace in a modern processing plant, and then help them develop those skills in the lack at many of their sites of senior people who can pass that knowledge on. So what should our expectations for you be? And then how do you develop yourself as an individual so that you can meet those expectations? So you'll see on this figure here, something that we're calling the Metcelerate method, because it's how we've looked at doing this. And it's really a combination of online and offline development activities that people can use. And so we've worked very closely with a couple of companies on developing this. We had some concepts, we took it to them, we're discussing with them and trying to tune it so that it really works, appreciating that everybody's in a different environment. But how do we create an environment that really works for people at different operations, taking advantage of the commonalities and the differences? And so you can see the types of aspects that we have here. What are we thinking about learning? How do we create a framework? How do we create a structure that people can really use to support developing as an engineer who really can function and add value at a site? And so the program looks at mining from a high-level perspective, mining as a value stream from, if you will, a raw deposit in the ground to the marketplace. What are all the aspects we should be concerned with? And then at a much more detailed level, the processing component of that value stream, and how do we make it function so it best supports that value stream from ore body to market, and make sure that it maximizes its value from many different perspectives to all of the different stakeholders who are involved in that. And then here's an example. We've gone and said, well, okay, as a metallurgist, and you're working with this, what should you know as a metallurgist who working around a particular type of process? And in this case, it's around comminution. And so we've identified it out at a high level. What are the types of tasks that the engineer might expect to be involved with? So around managing inputs, managing equipment, managing the process, managing outputs, and tried to make that much more specific. And then we provide training so that people can really understand what do these things mean? Because it's easy to stick them there, but then what do they mean? And I suspect, I can see we have several viewers watching. Each one of them would interpret that differently. So how do we achieve a consistent definition of what these mean, and then create skills so that people can translate, if you will, understanding what they mean and the fundamentals behind them to actually practices at an operation. And we've gone on from there to take a similar view across, if you will, the entire processing space for physical processing of raw materials and that. And soon we're about to roll this out to a group. So it'll be an interesting experiment, I think. So that's really the presentation part on this. I'm sure, Jan, you may have a couple of things you'd like to say.
Oh, I think I'm going to let Sarah take over here and ask some questions rather, because I think we've set the scene for the risk that I think is quite real of our skills of extraction being so reduced of late. Sarah,
Thank you so much, Bob and Jan, for that. I wonder if you could just stop sharing your screen, because then we can see all of your lovely faces on the screen at once, so we can have this final discussion together. That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Jan. So with this, and I mean, this is a question to both of you. Earlier on, we heard a number of our speakers, for example, Joel, talking about how do we really make sure that the professionals that get their degrees at university actually have enough of a range of the spectrum in terms of getting different disciplines or learning from different disciplines. Because especially with regards to this world of responsible raw materials, you could be the world's best metallurgist, but if all you know about is how to get the copper or the cobalt out of this rock, then actually you're not really that useful, because you also need to be aware of all of the other stuff that goes on as well. I don't know, maybe if I come to Jan first and then go to Bob, what you think to that commentary.
Sarah, I think it's a really, really important point to make. And I'm listening to the conversations over the last 2 days, this question of responsibility, of sustainability, and how that fits into the whole value chain and what the role is of each person within that has really come out. Now, I very strongly agree with that. And we see that as one of the things that you have to learn, not only at university, but it probably is a good opportunity to see the whole spectrum, but also within the organization, how that not within the organization, how the value chain fits between the geologists and the miners, the minerals processors and the metal producers, and even the marketing at the back end, the front end. But I think this is a role where the university really has a very important role to play, to introduce all these things that are not only technical into the curriculum as well, and to be sure that the sustainability aspects, the community aspects, and all that come into the professionalism of our trainings. But that is something that I think in industry, while industry can help with that, their focus is very much on the extraction side or on the money making side, and so you need to balance those two.
Brilliant, thanks, Jan. Bob, do you have something to add to that?
Yes, I think that one thing that we must continually reinforce, and I think it's a much abused concept, but we've had this discussion for some time around lifelong learning, and the reality is we do need lifelong learning, and there's only so much you can push into somebody with a fire hydrant in a couple of years. So if you look at this, you say, okay, I've got some expectations for uni graduates. What really should they know in coming out of uni? And a good part of that should be understanding some basics about how to learn and some concepts like Jan mentioned. And then you move into the workplace and you've got a certain role and you probably decide to specialize. So we need help develop you for that. And as you come along, we really have two aspects, as you mentioned, to consider. One is around improving breadth and the other is improving depth. And we've had quite some discussion in the development space around that, about creating individuals with different configurations from T to A to et cetera, et cetera. And I think part of it depends on what the individual wants to take on in their life as roles and where they want to go. And the other is within the corporate world is at different levels and different places in a corporation, you need different types of people. In that, so you need people perhaps at certain roles able to look at that breadth from undisturbed land to many decades later, disturbed land that has been recycled for human use, acceptable human use. And so how do we manage that? And it takes different people, and we need to develop people so they can slot into those roles. And even more importantly, so they understand the other people in their roles and how, for example, if I need to know something about this, I might be a more technical person and you might be a broader experienced person. I should go and talk to you if I have a question, and vice versa. So there's a number of things that could really be taking place and must be taking place as we continue to develop people for their lives, and not just you've come out of the egg and I'm gonna be the bird and kick you out of the nest and you better fly.
Brilliant, thanks for that, Bob. Another question that's just come in here is around attracting people into universities to do certain courses. And so, for example, if we take the geosciences, and so full disclosure, Jan and I first met one another whilst I was doing my PhD at Imperial College London, which of course was only a few years ago, wasn't it, Jan? It was in our far distant past. And this is something here where perhaps over the years, we actually see a decrease in people being interested in going and doing your more traditional geoscience subjects, for example, at university. And so there's a lot of chatter at the moment around, do we need to rebrand geoscience or reframe what geoscience is actually all about? And I mean, again, a number of the talks earlier on spoke to some of the great work that's been done by the likes of the Geological Society to try and shift this understanding. But I just wondered if you guys might be able to comment with regards to how society's expectations perhaps are changing who is interested in studying key subjects at university, but also what are universities doing to try and maybe reconfigure courses to maintain that attraction to students. Who wants to go first? I'm looking at both of you. Should I go to Jan first?
I think well, yeah.
Thank you, Jan.
Look, it's a perennial question as well. Even when I was a student now, many years ago, the question was, we started at, we were 7 graduates in South Africa in mineral processing a year. And so to think that that only 7 people who graduated in the 80s, and now we're back to that situation again when we're very few graduates. I think there are a couple of issues here, and getting people into the industry is very difficult from the ground up. And I think a lot of it has to come at a later stage where we need to be more flexible in who we take into the industry later on, and how they only get to know the industry at their time at university, for example. So I know at Imperial, a lot of people come to study geology. They come with great ideals of being of just learning about the world, and then realizing, well, I have to get a job at the end of it. And then many of them go and work for non-necessarily mining companies, but then in the end, when they do work for mining companies, they only learn about mining when they're on the course. They didn't actually come into geology to be a mine geologist. And I think the same is with engineering, process engineering, is you end up with chemical engineers who want to study chemical engineering and realize it's process engineering and any kind of processing in the mining industry interesting for them, and they shift into that. And that facilitation we need to do. And I don't think we need to worry too much about people coming into the industry. We need to make it attractive for them to move into the industry at a later stage, and to move out of it as well. To be perfectly frank, we need to have an interchange of people back and forth. And then the second thing is, I think that the skill set of the industry needs to change. We're very technical at the moment still, and we're losing out on a very big class of people who are interested in the social aspects, the environmental aspects, better technical aspects. I mean, the discussion that Leif had about autonomy was fascinating. And I mean, none of us can do that. We need to learn that from a different type of engineer. And I think that's what's happening in industries. We're changing the group of people that we are having in. But the problem, I think, just to finally end up, is that the core of the people we need are still the technical people to do the mining, do the extraction. And if we're going to lose those, we really the skills in those, we're really in big trouble.
Brilliant, thanks, Jan. Bob, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, it's it's really a devil's challenge in that. And I remember a few years ago, I actually moved to a mining place where it was, to be honest, working in the mining industry globally, it was one of the better ever possible, as an example. It was on the ocean coast of Queensland, about 400, 500 kilometers north of Brisbane. And I've got to tell you that working in this industry, it doesn't get much better than that. And it was interesting interviewing people and finding people didn't want to move there. And they said, I just couldn't live in a place like this. I'm going, how do people get to this point that they really don't understand where mines perhaps are located and such? And so I'll take it back to the more present time. It's interesting seeing the statistics about how many people graduate with any degree and the large fraction who then go, I don't know why I did that. So I think from a social perspective, we need to find some better ways to expose disciplines to people before they're going to college and that. And I don't know the past for that, but what's so fascinating is I'll call it propaganda from television, as many people still thinking mining is something out of the 1800s and earlier. And the fact is that's a negative sell to anyone. So mining has quite a challenge. And I think given that, we really need to find ways to be smarter about how we work in the future and balance on-site and remote work. And I see much idealism in this space, but from having been involved with some different activities at Rio and Freeport around trying to do this better, the idealism doesn't work because somebody's got to be at the mine and somebody can work remote, but they've got to work together. And often we lose sight of that. So I think that in trying to find some paths forward, we need to somehow balance the practice with the idealism. So that's some comment there.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much. So just to draw this actually to a close, but we have just had one final question. So Sean, I will ask your question, and this will be the final one going to the group for today's session. And Sean asks, who drives this change in training at the university level? Does it have to come from industry or research bodies, professional societies, etc., or does it come from somewhere else? And so therefore, does there need to be a new code around training at university level?
It's a risky conversation to get into with my Imperial College hat on. And all I can say, be perfect. So it really doesn't, it's not us that has to change. But that's often the case at the university. So it's a real problem, is that universities don't always know what is happening in industry and what the needs of industry are. And I think there's a much bigger need for that debate and that discussion to happen. It's interesting for us because when we started the Accelerator program, the curriculum we have is developed with companies. So we went into companies and said, well, we've got an idea of what we think people need, but what do you actually need? And they told us, and then we developed the curriculum around that. And you don't see that happening in universities because the role of the university is different. The role of the university is to teach the basics, the fundamentals, the science, the physics, and companies don't, they might care about that, but I think they really care about the practice. And I think that's the change there. I think the final point I do want to make about this is that, and Sarah, you'll be aware of this as well, is that the link between research and teaching is really important. I think we can, if we go to universities and say you have to teach new stuff, then there's no new textbook. You have to write the textbook, then go do the research of the textbook, then write the textbook, then someone else will use it for teaching. And so the latest stuff has to come out of the research aspect. And then the research has to be industry related. So that circle comes through research, I think. So improving industry, improving the teaching, back to the industry, improvement of the people, that virtuous circle is currently, I think, slightly broken with the industry downturn. But I think but that would be how I would fix that, is to get that going back again.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jan. And any final comments from yourself, Bob?
Just a comment on how do we develop the workforce of the future. I think that it's, after many decades of having a model around university graduates with 4-year degrees and such, we need to revisit and understand a little bit better, what do we really need in the workplace? And is that model the best, or are there alternative models where we have shorter times at university and learning afterwards? So we have a balance that better reflects the workforce needs, if you will. And an example there would be, often we have people who are quite comfortable living in mining camps because they grew up in them. They don't go away for university. Are there shorter degrees we could develop for them that might work now with people who actually enjoy living in such areas? So I think we need to break out of a rigorous model that perhaps we've been trapped into and look at some changes going forward to better understand what are the knowledge and skill needs of people to best fit into the industry of the future. So that's the thought I have on that. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Bob, Jan, and to all of our other fabulous speakers that have given us a really interesting session this afternoon. Massive thanks to Sean for all of your recording, and we look forward to the blog that will materialize later, and also to Kieran as well. And finally, because I can see Murray waving at me there, ladies and gentlemen, don't forget about our overnight challenge, which, yes, is go and find a scrap piece of paper. So yes, we are hopefully recycling bits of paper. So this can be an old envelope, etc., or something like that. And on that piece of paper, draw your impression of what you think a mine actually is. So what do you think a mine is? And once you've drawn that picture, you can sign it or not, it's totally up to you. Take a picture of it and send it through to hello@responsiblerawmaterials.com. That is hello@responsiblerawmaterials.com. And Rose and I will not only use it to help us summarize and conclude the conference tomorrow, but we will also pass it across to Anthea, who works with Murray, to help with all of her research as a whole. Rose, is there anything else we need to say before we wave goodbye to everybody this evening? Rose is shaking her head at me. So brilliant. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, a massive, massive thank you to all of our fantastic speakers here today. We have our final session starting off tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. UK time. So a reminder for any of those speakers out there who are joining us tomorrow morning, we will be starting at 7:30 so that you can practice sharing your slides, etc. And let's make sure that tomorrow morning is a fabulous conclusion to this conference. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a lovely evening. Good night.
Thanks very much. Good night.